My name is Sasha, and I was 30 years old when I understood that silence is not weakness. It is patience with excellent aim. I grew up watching my mother handle difficult people with a kind of quiet authority I didn't fully appreciate until I was much older. She never raised her voice at dinner tables or demanded apologies in parking lots. She simply waited, watched, and when the moment arrived, she said exactly what needed to be said. Nothing more, nothing less. I thought that was just her personality. I didn't realize until I was grown that it was a skill she had been quietly teaching me my whole life. I became a Crown attorney at 26. For those unfamiliar, in Canada that means I work for the Public Prosecution Service, the government lawyers who prosecute criminal cases on behalf of the Crown, financial crime, securities fraud, organized corporate corruption, the kind of cases that take years to build and, when they finally collapse in a courtroom, take entire empires with them. It is not a glamorous job. There are no cameras, no dramatic speeches delivered in prime time. There is just evidence, preparation, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. I was good at it. I was, if I am being honest with myself, very good at it. But my husband's family didn't know that. They knew I worked some government job at a downtown Toronto office. My mother-in-law had described it once, to a room full of dinner guests, as something with cases and paperwork. She said it the way you might describe a hobby someone takes a little too seriously, with warmth calibrated precisely to minimize. I let them believe it. Before I go any further, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever had to keep your real self hidden, just to survive someone else's idea of who you should be, hit that like button. You are going to want to stay for this one. The dinner happened in August at my in-laws' family cottage on a lake in Muskoka. If you're not from Ontario, Muskoka is what people mean when they say cottage country. It is 3 hours north of Toronto, where the Canadian Shield pushes up through the earth, and the lakes run so deep they stay cold even in the height of summer. The families who own Muskoka waterfront property have usually owned it for generations. It signals a particular kind of inherited wealth, the quiet linen blazer kind that doesn't need to announce itself because the private does it for them. My father-in-law Warren had built his money in commercial real estate development across the GTA. My mother-in-law, Rosemary, had spent 30 years carefully cultivating the kind of social network that gets your son named to boards and your grandchildren into the right private schools without anyone having to say it directly out loud. She was masterful at it, genuinely. If social climbing were an Olympic discipline, she would be giving clinics. My husband Damon was the younger of 2 sons and had spent his whole life in the quiet, exhausting effort of competing for an approval that could only ever be provisionally granted. His older brother, Brody, was the golden one. Brody had gone to Osgood, articled at a Bay Street firm, and made partner by 34. He was loud in the particular way of men who have never once doubted their own intelligence. The kind of loud that occupies a room not because it is compelling but because it refuses to leave space for anything else. The August gathering was meant to celebrate 70 years of the cottage in the family. About 40 people, old family friends, business associates, a few local politicians from the riding, 2 developers Warren was courting for a project in Etobicoke. The kind of party where the wine list runs longer than the guest list and everyone still arrives with a bottle from the LCBO anyway, out of habit. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing notable. After 2 years of marriage, I had learned that the most efficient way to survive my in-laws' social events was to take up as little space as possible, agree pleasantly when spoken to, refill my own glass quietly, and never under any circumstances mention my caseload. My mother-in-law moved through the crowd like a woman conducting a symphony only she could hear. Every guest was a note in a composition she had been refining for decades. She touched elbows, redirected people toward the water view, ensured the right conversations happened between the right people at the right moment. When she stopped beside me near the buffet, I already knew what register the moment would take before she opened her mouth. "This is Sasha," she said to the woman beside her, the wife of a local councillor. Damon's wife. She works for the government, one of those support roles in the legal system, very stable. Very consistent hours. She delivered it with such warm sincerity that you would have needed to be paying close attention to hear what was underneath it. That stability and consistent hours were the ceiling of what I could claim, not just a feature of my schedule. The counselor's wife offered me a smile of polite pity. How lovely. That must take so much off your plate not having to bring work home. It has its moments, I said. Rosemary patted my arm once and drifted back into her performance. Damon was across the dock with his father, laughing with the amplified energy of a man who has been understudying a role his whole life, and wants tonight to be the night the director finally notices. He had barely looked at me since we arrived. Brody held court near the fire pit as the evening deepened, the way he always did. He was telling a story about a civil fraud case his firm had recently settled, a result he described as a masterclass in strategic negotiation under pressure. The guests around him nodded at careful intervals. A few of the older men asked follow-up questions, with the reverence people reserved for surgeons and hockey coaches. I stood near the edge of the group with a glass of Niagara Riesling, watching. I knew the case he was talking about. I had read the public filings that spring. He had not won anything. The opposing party had simply exhausted their resources and walked away. That is not strategy, that is arithmetic. But no one standing at that fire pit had the context to know the difference, and Brody understood that perfectly. He had been working with that gap in knowledge his entire career. He was still talking when he turned his head and found me watching him. Something shifted in his expression. A decision, small and fast, made the way experienced advocates make decisions in a room, quickly and without visible deliberation. Sasha, he said loudly enough to redirect the group's attention toward me. You work in the legal system, right, government side? I do, I said. What is it exactly you do over there? I can never quite remember. He smiled in a way that made clear he remembered perfectly and had simply chosen this moment to pretend otherwise. Prosecution, I said, criminal matters. He tilted his head, performing curiosity. Municipal offenses? Provincial bylaw stuff? That kind of thing? There was a ripple of tentative laughter from a few guests who weren't sure whether they were supposed to laugh but felt the pull of the room. Federal, I said. Ah, he nodded slowly as though updating a minor note in a document he didn't consider particularly important. So case management, file review, administrative support for the actual litigators. He turned back slightly toward the fire, signaling the exchange was essentially resolved. Honestly, I think a lot of people underestimate how much of the legal world is support-level work. It's not for everyone to be in front of a bench, and there's absolutely no shame in that. He looked at me again with an expression carefully engineered to resemble generosity. You probably provide a really valuable function back there. The group drifted back to their own conversations. My mother-in-law appeared at the edge of the circle. She caught my eye with the particular smile she reserved for moments when she felt the family hierarchy had been successfully maintained. I took a slow sip of my wine. It was dry and clean and cold, and it took exactly as long to swallow as I needed to let the moment settle. At the far end of the long cedar table, a woman I had been watching all evening set down her glass. Her name was Justice Kwan. She had been appointed to the Court of Appeal for Ontario 16 months earlier, and she was one of the most respected appellate jurists in the province. She was in her mid-50s, precise and unhurried, with the kind of stillness that courtrooms develop in people over decades of listening carefully to arguments that are almost, but not quite, convincing. Rosemary had introduced her to other guests as a friend of Warren's from the golf club, offered the way you offer a credential you don't fully understand but assume is socially useful. She had not introduced Justice Kwan to me. Justice Kwan had not said anything in over an hour. She had simply listened. Now she picked up her glass, set it down again with care, and looked directly at me from across the table. Her expression had shifted from neutral to something I recognized, the quiet, focused recalibration of someone who has just placed a face they were trying to remember. Forgive the interruption, she said. Not loudly but with the clean projection of someone who has spent years ensuring courtrooms could hear her without her having to strain. Are you Sasha Vaillancourt? The name landed in a way that made several people turn their heads simultaneously. I am, I said. She set her glass down with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. I thought so. I sat on the appellate panel for the Kellerman fraud conviction last spring. Your written submissions were. She paused for exactly the fraction of a second that careful people use when they want the next word to land with full weight. Exceptional. Among the finest appellate briefs I have reviewed in 20 years on the bench. The word exceptional fell on the table like something with mass. I said quietly, "Thank you, Justice Kwan." Brody had gone very still. Justice Kwan continued, with the conversational ease of someone who either had no idea what she was detonating or had a perfect idea and was proceeding anyway. "And you just concluded the Heartstone Securities prosecution, didn't you? I've been following the coverage on CBC since the verdicts came through. 3.5 years of preparation on that case, if I recall correctly." "Just over 3.5, yes," I said. "Extraordinary result." She looked around the table, not unkindly but with the authority of someone whose assessments tend to conclude conversations rather than open them. For anyone not following the file, the Heartstone prosecution was one of the largest financial fraud cases in Ontario in the last decade. 17 corporate defendants, 42 counts, convictions on all primary charges. She lifted her glass again. Ms. Vaillancourt led the prosecution team. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel people recalibrating around the table. The subtle physical reorientations of guests who had been nodding in one direction for 2 hours and were now facing another entirely. Brody's firm had represented one of the 17 Heartstone defendants. They had lost badly. I had read the post-verdict coverage. I watched my brother-in-law make the connection in real time. It happened the way certain realizations happen to very smart people. Fast, complete, and without any of the usual grace period for adjustment. A lurch quickly controlled, not quite quickly enough. Justice Kwan finished the last of her wine, set the glass down once more and pushed her chair back. "I need to step inside and return a call, but Sasha, it was genuinely a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Your office does important work." She looked, briefly and without apparent intent, toward where Brody was standing with his glass. "The bar is always stronger for the people willing to do the unglamorous work with real precision." She walked inside. The fire crackled. Someone on the far end of the dock laughed at something unrelated, the sound carrying easily over the water as though the last 4 minutes had not occurred at all. The drive back to Toronto that night was 2 hours on the 400. And for the first 40 minutes there was only the sound of the engine and Damon's controlled breathing, which I had learned to read the way you read weather. Past Barry, he hit the steering wheel with the flat of his hand. He told me I had humiliated his brother deliberately, that I had arranged the whole thing, brought Justice Quant into it somehow, engineered the moment, manufactured an opportunity to make Brody look small in front of 40 people, because I was resentful and had never genuinely accepted his family. He told me his mother had spent years building those relationships and I had poisoned a single evening out of spite. He told me if I had any real commitment to this marriage, I would have introduced myself properly at the start of the night instead of sitting quietly and waiting. I told him I had not introduced myself to Justice Kwan at all, she had introduced herself to me. He told me that was not the point. I didn't ask what the point was. I already knew. The point was that his family's comfort depended on my smallness, and I had briefly become visible, and that was unforgivable in a way that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what he needed me to be. We did not speak again until we reached our building in the distillery district. They arrived the next morning. I was still at my kitchen island with a coffee and a case file on my laptop when the intercom rang. Rosemary and Brody came up together, which told me this had been coordinated before either of them had left Muskoka. Damon let them in without coming to tell me they were there. I heard the shape of the conversation from the hallway. When I came out, Brody was standing with his arms folded in a way meant to signal authority over the space, and there was a folder on the kitchen counter. He told me, without preamble, in the tone of a man who has decided the courtesy of preamble is not warranted, that the family had discussed the situation and reached a conclusion. He said the marriage was clearly not working. He said, Damon deserved better than a wife who had spent years concealing her professional identity to manufacture a social ambush at a family gathering. He used the word concealing deliberately, with the emphasis of a man who wants a word on the record. The folder held a separation agreement. He had drafted it himself. I'll give him this. It was clean work. The language was precise and the release clauses were thorough. He had included a mutual waiver of all separately held and independent assets, which he had inserted to protect the family's real estate holdings from any claim I might make during proceedings. Under the agreement, I would receive a lump sum of $10,000 and my proportional share of equity in our jointly held condo, which after mortgage discharge, legal fees, and real estate commission would amount to roughly $17,000, $27,000 total. He told me this was generous given the brevity of the marriage and the circumstances. He told me his time was limited this morning. He told me I should read it and sign it, and he could have his assistant file it that afternoon. Rosemary stood by the window that looks over the distillery courtyard and watched me with the expression of a woman who has already written the ending and is simply waiting for the last pages to fill in. Damon sat at the kitchen table. He did not look at me once. I read the agreement carefully, which made Brody visibly impatient. He checked his watch. I read it again. The mutual waiver was precisely as I had understood it from his verbal summary. Comprehensive, bilateral. Neither party could reach into the other's separately held assets following execution. It had been drafted to build a wall around the family's real estate holdings. It also, as a necessary consequence of its own thoroughness, built the exact same wall around everything I held independently. I had been contributing the annual maximum to my TFSA since I was 22 years old. I held a non-registered investment portfolio I had built methodically over 8 years, guided in part by an intimate professional familiarity with industries I had spent my career prosecuting. Because when your job is to follow money for 3.5 years at a time, you develop a clear sense of where it moves, where it hides, and, occasionally, where it compounds quietly and without notice. I had also received a significant inheritance from my grandmother 4 years earlier, which I had invested and never mentioned to anyone in my husband's family because there had never been a compelling reason to. My net worth at the time of signing was just under $1.4 million. Brody's agreement, designed to protect a real estate empire from a woman he believed earned a modest crown salary, had been drafted so comprehensively that it also made it legally impossible for my husband to ever claim a fraction of what I actually had. Brody handed me a pen. I signed. I want to tell you something about that moment. For a long time afterward, I wondered whether I should have corrected the record earlier, said something quietly at one dinner or another, let someone catch a glimpse of a file, offered enough information to lower the temperature before it reached boiling. I used to think that was the failure, letting it go so long. But that is not how it works with people who have already made their decision about you. When you tell them something that contradicts the image they've built, they don't update the image. They find a way to fit what you've said into the frame they already have. Explanation doesn't move them. Consequence does. That is the only language that actually lands. The Law Society of Ontario holds a tribute dinner every autumn, and that year it was held at the Fairmont Royal York in downtown Toronto. The old hotel on Front Street with the vaulted ceilings and the particular hushed gravity that makes voices smaller, which has always struck me as appropriate because it tends to remind people of scale. My office had nominated me for the Crown Counsel Recognition Award, given annually to a federal prosecutor in recognition of sustained contribution to the administration of justice in Ontario. It is not a well-known distinction outside the legal community. Within it, it means that your peers have looked at your work clearly and called it what it is. I had received the nomination 2 weeks before I signed the separation agreement. I had not mentioned it to anyone. The evening of the dinner I wore my good suit, charcoal gray, fitted precisely, the one I wear when I am arguing before a panel and I want the bench to register that I have not rushed the morning. I arrived alone and took my seat beside colleagues from the office. The room filled in around 7. Brody arrived with 2 senior partners from his firm and a client whose name I recognized immediately, because a file bearing that name was currently on my desk in active case review. I noted it the way I note everything useful, quietly, and for later. He didn't see me until he had already crossed into the main hall. The recognition moved through him clearly from across the room, the same lurch as on the Muskoka dock but larger, because the room was larger, and the people witnessing it wore more hardware on their lapels. He said something to the partner beside him. Both of them looked toward my table. The partner's expression shifted in a way that told me Brody had not fully briefed his firm on the nature of his relationship with the woman who had led the prosecution that dismantled their most significant client. The Law Society president opened the formal program at 8. The awards segment was third on the agenda. When she read my name, the applause at the surrounding tables began before she finished the sentence. I walked to the stage the way I walk into any courtroom, straight back, nothing wasted, pace measured. The president shook my hand and said, "For the room that the award recognized the Hearthstone prosecution specifically, 42 convictions, 3.5 years of preparation, and a standard of evidentiary construction she described as establishing a new benchmark for financial crime prosecution in Ontario." I thanked my team, I thanked the office, and then I said one more thing because the moment offered it and I had spent enough time being quiet. I said that the work that matters most in any institution is almost never the loudest work. It is the work done carefully, without an audience, by people who understand that accuracy does not require performance. I said that the legal system in this country runs on exactly those people, the ones who actually know what they are doing, which is often considerably more than the most confident voice in any given room tends to assume. I did not look at Brody when I said it. I did not need to. The account freeze orders came through 4 days later. Brody's firm had represented a numbered company that investigators had identified as having active financial ties to a secondary network my office was tracking in parallel with the Hearthstone file. When the warrants expanded, they expanded in directions that intersected with corners of the family's real estate operations, corners involving contracts awarded under circumstances described in the supporting affidavit as requiring further examination. I was not the prosecutor assigned to that file. I had recused myself the morning my separation was finalized, because I am not someone who uses professional authority to settle personal grievances. That is not who I am, and it is not who I intend to become. Someone else from the office carried it forward. I answered their questions when asked, because that is what witnesses do. But I had known for some time that the geography of the investigation was moving in that direction. My father-in-law spent several weeks in uncomfortable conversations with federal investigators before his counsel negotiated a cooperation arrangement. Brody's firm received a regulatory inquiry from the Law Society. The family's numbered company had its active development contracts suspended pending the outcome of the audit. The Muskoka cottage, I learned through a mutual acquaintance in November, had been listed for sale. Damon was waiting outside my office building on a Thursday morning in October. He was wearing the same good coat he'd had on at the cottage party, but it looked different now. Not damaged, exactly, but like something that no longer fit the person wearing it. He had dark circles, and he was holding a Tim Hortons coffee cup in both hands, which told me he had been standing there long enough to need something to hold. He said my name when he saw me coming through the revolving door. I stopped on the sidewalk. Bay Street morning rush moved around us the way water moves around a fixed point, continuous and indifferent. He told me he was sorry. He said he had been wrong about a number of things and had known it longer than he'd admitted to himself. He said his mother had spent his entire life teaching him that strength meant alignment with her vision, and that he had organized himself so completely around her approval that there was very little left of him that wasn't performing a role she had assigned. I believed him. I believed that he believed it, and I thought it was probably true. He said he wanted to know if there was any possibility of starting again. I looked at this man I had spent 4 years trying to love around the obstacle of his family, and I felt something close to grief, the clean kind, not the kind that argues with itself, the kind that knows what it is. I told him I was genuinely glad he was doing the work of understanding that about himself. I told him I hoped he found his way to something real. I told him I had signed a separation agreement and had no intention of revisiting it. He stood there for a moment without speaking, the coffee going cold in his hands. I told him to take care of himself. Then I badged into the building and took the elevator to the 14th floor, where my office window looks out over the city, and on a clear day, all the way south to the lake. The thing my mother understood and that took me years to really absorb, is that you cannot prove yourself to people who have already made their decision. You cannot argue them out of the image they have of you. You can only build something real and true, in the quiet space they have cleared by looking somewhere else, and let the facts present themselves when the time arrives. My in-laws were not complicated villains. They were people who had organized their entire world around a particular idea of status, and I did not fit that idea, so they filed me under irrelevant and carried on. It was not personal in the way cruelty sometimes is. That almost makes it harder to name, but it also makes it simpler to understand. You cannot negotiate with a reflex. You can only wait until it runs out of room. I have a good life now. My work matters in ways I can measure, in convictions filed, in dollars of fraud recovered, in people who did not lose their retirement savings because someone in a government building in downtown Toronto was willing to follow the money patiently, without recognition for years at a time. I have a house in the East End that I bought outright. I have a cat. I have colleagues I would trust with almost anything. I did not need my mother-in-law's dinner table to confirm my worth. I only needed to know my worth clearly enough that when someone tried to hand me a smaller version of myself, I had nowhere to put it. If this story feels like something you have lived some version of, if you have ever been written off by people too busy performing their own importance to look clearly at what was actually in front of them, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me your story. There are more of us out here than any of them thought to count. Hit like and subscribe to Furry Revenge for more stories about people who stayed quiet and then did not.